Welcome to the Prepared Leader, From Crisis to Confidence. This is the podcast for leaders who know that resilience isn't just something you plan for, it's something you practice. I'm Helen Lipscomb, and in every episode we explore the human side of high-stakes leadership, the real habits, hard lessons, and surprising strengths that prepare leaders to navigate disruption and lead through uncertainty. Today, we are talking about an interesting leadership journey, one that begins in the world of food safety and evolves into business continuity and organizational resilience. Because many leaders first encounter preparedness through compliance, standards, controls, regulatory frameworks. But somewhere along the way, ideally and hopefully, the realization happens. Resilience isn't just about following the rules. It's about preparing people to respond when the rules run out. My guest today is Larry Coons, whose career has taken exactly that journey. Together, we will explore what leaders can learn from the disciplines of safety, continuity, and resilience, and why they may have more in common than we think. Larry, welcome to the Prepared Leader. We're really excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So your background in your role, you started in the food safety world. What is it that drew you to that initially? What made you think about that as a starting point for your career?
Well, growing up, I was always involved with and fascinated by food. From the time that I was able to speak, I was telling my family I was going to own a restaurant, and everyone had assigned roles, from mom making the desserts, dad running the grill, to my sister seating people at their tables. And then as I got a bit older, I realized that I really don't want to be working the time that everyone is out having fun. So I
Mm-hmm.
kind of shifted. Plus, it's really hard to be a chef and be a really good chef, a successful one at that.
Yeah.
So I kind of pivoted and decided I was going to go into international business marketing in German. And then during one of my breaks from university, I was working at the plant that my dad worked at, and they happened to be a supplier of McDonald's and other QSRs. And I got put into their product development lab, and I
Okay.
just fell in love with it instantly. And then the gentleman I worked for, he had gone to university, got a degree in food science, and started talking to me about it. And I was like, wait, this is a real thing you could do? Like, he's like, yeah, how do you think food ends up on the table and in packages and all this and that? I'm like, wow, that sounds really cool. So I completely shifted, changed plans, moved universities, and pursued a degree in food science. And from there, the rest is kind of history.
Wow, fascinating. And very much that kind of, as you said, I suppose as we started, that very much in that compliance space of both recognizing you are passionate about food, but also recognizing that there's a lot around I guess, the world of food that we manage and we control, and we are trying to keep everyone safe, keep everyone, all that is a big part of the food industry. Yes, there's the chefing side, and obviously that's an important part of it, but actually there's, I guess, the background piece, the bit that sits underneath it that actually keeps the engine running of a food industry and the food world.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a whole
Yeah.
underbelly to it that we take for granted at times. And
Yes.
someone has to
Yes.
make that come to life.
Ah, fantastic. And I guess as we start to think about then as your career journey changed, what made you then start to think about resilience alongside food safety, and what made you start to think about that as I guess, as an additional element of consideration?
Well, throughout the years, I got to see different levels of food safety and food quality, from starting off in the plants itself to moving up more into an office role, dealing with the plants from afar, to then taking even a step further where I was working with third-party suppliers. And then
Mm.
my most recent role sat within global supply chain. And from there, I really got to see how much actually takes place as it gets expanded out at this extremely large global level. A- And one of my major roles was doing cook validations. And what that ends up doing is we would set the standards so that any restaurant across the world, based on whatever cooking mechanism they had, you would set certain settings for those, whether it be a fryer or a grill, And we would do all the testing in advance to say, okay, if you're cooking this product, you set these settings for this type of grill or this type of fryer, and you have a 99.999. I mean, the nines roll on and on and on and on because, one out of every 99.99% is still at one out of every 1,000 or one out of every 10,000. Can't do the math right now. And that's not good when you're selling millions at a time. So all the different layers of protection that have to go in place to ensure that when you're serving 70 million people a day across the globe, that you're not going to get someone sick or hurt. So that's what really sparked my interest in going, okay, what's the next level of all this here?
Yeah, because very much is that starting point for risk assessment, that very much that starting point for we need to be thinking about stopping disruption. And to your point, where possible and where practicable, eliminating where things can go wrong and eliminating where some of the challenges would come for an organization. So it is very much that starting point for, I guess, transitioning that risk management practice into, okay, how do we apply this to that wider scope of suppliers, keeping the business operating and keeping that challenge going?
Exactly, because it doesn't just stop at like a cook validation. I mean, you can roll it all the way back to the suppliers themselves on the certain steps that they need to take just to get a raw ingredient into their doors and then a raw product out their doors before it gets handed off to the next step, all the way before it goes into a consumer's hands. And, whether it's the testing that takes place, whether it's the kill steps or the analysis of the product itself, it all goes down. And then you still have to get it to your crew's hand, we'll say for in a restaurant example. And then you still have that human element too. Like one of the hardest parts about food safety was, I believe, it's one of the few things that everyone does themselves. Cooking and feeding yourself is something that everybody does. You don't have to go to a restaurant to get fed. So everyone takes those, their own little liberties on, oh, this is okay. This is fine. The 5-second rule is one of the things that drives me insane. Like, no, that's not the thing, especially when you're serving.
It's not an actual thing. We've just made that one up to make ourselves feel better.
Yeah. So you have to account for things like that and put all the other safeguards in place. And so we could come up with a cook validation, say, put these settings in place and you're fine. But again, that's assuming that one, the crew or the restaurant actually applies those correct settings, because it's a very complicated process. A lot of different products come in and out. It's easy to, mistake one for another. But then, is their equipment maintained properly? And then even if it's maintained properly, did the product come from the facility in the correct way? You could account for certain thicknesses, and if it's off by only so much in the wrong direction, that's an undercooked product. So if your equipment's not cleaned, if your product's not right, if there's not dehydration, there's all these different variables that come into play. So you have to keep putting another layer upon layer upon layer, which comes down to doing food safety checks within the restaurant. And then there's so much more to that as well. So naturally, coming from food safety, I'm all about, how do I ensure that this is going to work, even if one other thing goes wrong? What are my other steps to keep it going there?
Yeah. And I think that, and also coming back to your comment about food safety is the thing that we all do. To me, that's exactly the same for business continuity and resilience. Most people don't label it. And again, most people wouldn't actively think, oh, I'm doing food safety. I'm looking after the passage of food from the supermarket, because most of us aren't farming it, but passage of food from supermarket to me eating it, and I'm doing the right controls within that. People don't think about that. And again, people don't think about that when they're thinking about risk and resilience, because we innately do it. And whether we have put in our own little guardrails around like the 5-second rule or not, we do innately do things, and we do innately have in our brains, this is the level of risk I accept, and these are the controls that I'm going to put in place to make sure that I'm safe, my customers are safe, and if you transfer that to business continuity, it's that same process of, this is the level of risk I will accept in terms of disruption, and these are the controls that I will put into place to make sure that my customers and my clients, whatever that group of individuals is that are taking your products, are not going to be disrupted. And I think it's that same again, I can sort of very much see that logical connection point of how do you make this work, but also make people realize this isn't something new or different. This is just what you've always been doing. We're just doing it at a bigger scale, mostly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is really interesting. And I think thinking that through, that's why to me I guess your switch makes a lot of sense. One, because you've seen it in practice. You've seen how supply chains work, very complicated supply chains work, and you've seen some of the controls and measures that need to be put in place. But you can also come from a perspective of this is about thinking about safety and starting from that perspective of from a basis of food safe for you is around where you started was how do I make sure that the food is safe for people to eat? And how do I make sure that there's a level of control in for anyone that's getting involved in our food journey to make sure that it's that, and it's just, again, that same principles. Does that make sense? Is that kind of how you think you're approaching it now as you come into the world of business continuity, extending that way of thinking?
I think back to one of my earliest examples of business continuity within food safety, and it was I think we were running 8 full kitchens that were erected in the middle of a convention center. So not a place that restaurants are meant to be. The big joke is always the ghost of conventions past that come around. So you could have an equipment that has worked perfectly fine, done all the testing, day of, something is bound to go wrong. And how and why we have so many unexplained issues that have come up that it just doesn't make sense. One of the things that we were trying to do was showcase a new technology by using tablets and digital priometers and doing all of our food safety tests within in the digital space versus the old school priometer and paper way. We tested it, it worked. Well, lo and behold, when it came time to actually work, there was too much interference with all the different Bluetooth devices because this is probably about 10 years ago and it wasn't quite as where it is now.
Yep.
And when you introduced so many of those different devices in the same place at the same time, that all went haywire. So everything that we were relying on to do our food safety checks was completely out the window. And we serve in roughly a grand total of 36 hours or so, total runtime over like the 3.5, 4 days, about 200,000 items crossed the counter. And that's not a space that you have a lot of room for error. So extremely high stress, extremely high visibility to so many leaders within the organization. So we were told this was going to work. We tested it, it worked. So what happens? What do you do? Well, I had backup copies of the paper versions all on hand, and the priometer still works. They had digital displays. So throw the tablets in the trash, grab the paper, go back to how we always did it, and off and we went. So didn't know I was doing business continuity at the moment, but that is exactly what was taking place. So when I hit certain situations now, my role is more of the business continuity governance for the organization, not getting into the nitty-gritty of it all. I kind of put that hat back on and go, okay, what is my version of digital food safety that's failing, and how can I relate that to what's taking place here, and what are their paper copies? And I, luckily, being in a QSR organization, that tends to be an example that resonates with people, and I'm able to use and help them go, oh, that's what I need to do here. I'm like, yeah, exactly. So what is your paper copy
Version
to
of that.
the tablets?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good way because, again, that's one, you're a real direct example of business continuity. But actually, I like the way you are now using that as how you communicate about business continuity. Because, again, it is something that people kind of get a bit caught up on. What is it you're asking me to do? Oh, what does it mean when you say backup, or what does it mean when you say plan B? Whilst that to some extent sort of feels like it should be really obvious, I think people do overthink it quite a lot of the time. So the more we can make it relatable, the more you can come back to your examples of something that sits within your industry, sits within your organization. That must make it easier for people, as you say, to understand what you're asking of them, and easier for people to start to actually do business continuity now.
Exactly. Because, a lot of the people that you're working with, this is something completely new to them. They're not understanding the whys, the hows. They're seeing it as, giving me more work to do. And it's not giving more work to do. It's saving yourself more work in the future,
Mm,
really.
mm.
So given those examples, and one of the biggest takeaways from, they're not trained professionals like we are. So one of the biggest takeaways from my learning of BC is call it whatever you want. As long as it makes sense to the people who are doing the work, that's all that matters. We've got to take it out of our own heads sometimes and not use, to not get overly technical on the words we're using and however, as long as your audience understands what you're asking them to do, doesn't matter what you call it.
Exactly right. And again, I know we've discussed this a number of times about, how you frame this within your organization, but that is the bit that makes it more about how you do business continuity and resilience rather than the doing. Because suddenly it's part and parcel of how we operate. It becomes the how the business runs, which is that that I guess it's what we're all I believe it's what we should all be aiming for, because that is when it's embedded. It's when people are doing business continuity and resilience just by the very nature of operating, rather than thinking, oh, right, I need to sit down and do my business impact analysis. I need to do my plan. That, yes, you're asking them that. Yes, you're talking about that. But actually, you're doing it in a way that makes them think about what they do. What is it we need to keep doing? And ultimately, that for a QSR organization comes back to there are certain things that customers want and they come to you for. That's what we need to keep doing. So how do we then, I guess, phrases, I guess, how do you then come up with the right way of getting people to think about that rather than thinking about, I need to do a BIA, I need to do a plan, I need to do an exercise. All of that, again, is our terminology. It's the way we explain it, but because it gets to the end point. But when you're talking to organizations, you need to be saying it in a way that makes sense to them. So you shouldn't be talking about it. You should just be talking about, you have a thing that you do, you're a product you need to deliver. Think about that. What is it that could stop that from happening? What is it you would need to do if the first thing, like whether it's build the burger, make the coffee, whatever that is, if that can't be done, what are your options? It's sort of getting people to think about it in that way rather than worrying about some of the technical terms.
Right. And that's been one of the things too, is pulling a lot of different examples that I've come across in my time from supply chain up until now too, is what are some of those other examples I can use to help them understand? One time we ran out of a product on a limited time offer item. And by the time we were able to get back a product, the momentum was all lost and it was gone.
Hmm.
So the next time something came around, people were sitting in the room going, okay, what could go wrong here? And somebody went, well, we might have a tomatoes shortage. And someone goes, okay, well, hang on a second. Do we need those tomatoes to sell the sandwich? And they go, no, it's not critical to the build. It's not what's necessary. People get it without tomatoes all the time. So
Hmm.
someone in marketing and advertising goes, okay, great. So the LTO launches, it's a great success. Sure enough, boom, tomato shortage. Well, someone in marketing and advertising decides to flip the switch, and the pictures that they took of the original build with tomatoes on it, you
Hmm.
can't advertise it like that if you don't have tomatoes.
Yeah.
So they just swapped out the photos that they had without tomatoes and kept running it till the tomatoes were back and then swapped it back. So there was never a disruption there because the second we were out, they did what they needed to do and they advertised it as product was actually be able to, we could actually build it. So I bring that up to other teams as well quite a bit. And that starts to hit like, oh, so we need to bring these people into the conversation. That's what you need to start thinking about. Who else do you need here? Not just
Yeah.
you to
That's a,
actually keep this going.
that's a fantastic example, because again, that's a really good example of doing resilience in action. It's understanding that things do go wrong.
Right.
Let's plan for that, but let's plan for that in a meaningful way rather than just, again, have a plan on the shelf. It's okay, what would we need to quickly do, and just having different marketing assets available is a really simple thing that any organization can think about. Is what is it that actually, what are we advertising? Okay, if we can't deliver part of that, what can we still do? And how do we make sure that from a customer perspective, it doesn't suddenly seem like an inferior product? It doesn't suddenly seem like they're not getting what they've seen advertised, because actually they probably don't remember the bit where it said had tomatoes on the image anymore. Suddenly that the images that are flooding from a media perspective are now, okay, this is what this product looks like. This is what the LTO looks like. Don't worry about if you've seen it somewhere else and it had a tomato. That's not what it looks like now. And it might look like that in the future, but for right now, you go into the organization, you can buy this, and it looks exactly how you expect it to. But that's something that I think a lot of organizations that particularly run very complicated and challenging supply chains could really learn from, because that's a very simple thing to plan ahead. And having come from Starbucks, I know that that's an area that sometimes they were good at, sometimes they were bad at, and limited time offer products often do run out because of certain items not being available, because obviously they are designed specifically to highlight a certain thing or highlight a certain and usually it's a certain ingredient that you're trying to highlight, and that just runs out, and suddenly it's like, actually we can't offer this. I mean, it's something like a pumpkin latte that might be a bit more difficult, because if you haven't got the pumpkin, then it's just a latte. But
Right.
you can still plan ahead for that, and you could still plan for different things you could bring in that would help people from a customer perspective not to feel like they're not getting what they expected at that point. And I think that's a really good example, because again, that also to me talks a bit about what you're bringing to business continuity from your background, which is a much more of a learning approach. So let's actually, to that example, recognize that we do limited time offers a lot. QSRs do this all the time, and often they are, as I say, they run out very quickly because they're very popular, they're very well advertised, and everyone wants that thing at that moment. So recognizing that often is the case, or that there are things in the market that means that some of that product won't be available, is a really important thing that I'm not sure lots of organizations would do well.
Yeah. And one of the things I loved most about that example was the people in the room were asking what could go wrong and
Mm,
do we need this? So it was looking at the realistic disruptions that could take place.
mm,
They weren't thinking about the patty of the sandwich that is critical to selling the sandwich overall. Because if that goes down, if it's a specially made, chicken or whatever, you can't just use a different one and say, hey, it's still a spicy chicken when you have a regular chicken patty.
yeah,
But thinking about the disruptions that could take place that mattered most or were most likely to happen, because they knew because of the tomato shortages or when the harvesting was taking place, whatever, they were planning for that could realistically happen. Not
yeah.
that their entire product might get sunk at shit or sunk at sea or something like that. Like,
No.
probably unlikely to happen. But so you're not going to plan for that. But not having those tomatoes in place and then how that can impact the overall selling. I like how the whole team thought that through, not just the sandwich itself. Like you said, the advertising of it all.
Yeah. And again, I think that whole point you started on, when you kind of came to the end of that example of that connectivity piece, is such an important point, because again, no part of an organization is working in isolation. So business continuity professionals who spend a lot of time talking about the connective threads and the connective tissues. And I think we all often spend a lot of time just encouraging people to talk to each other, which can seem quite frustrating, but people don't do that without a little bit of a push often, because they just don't think like that. Organizations, by their very nature, are very much silo. We work in our silo, we do what we need to do, and we don't think about that kind of that way, the parallel level of, actually, if I'm not aware of what's happening in the farming markets, if I'm not aware of a tomato shortage from a marketing perspective or a product development perspective, I'm not thinking about that for this item. I'm just saying, well, we've got this exciting new product and we're going to sell it, and we've got all the lovely images and everyone's going to be really excited. So just having those conversations is a really important point. Do you find that business is more willing to do that now you've sort of started to explain this and use these examples?
I would like to say yes, but I think it's more I'm just getting used to it and
Mm.
knowing that because every time I have a conversation, it's basically with new stakeholders. So it's a revolving door of who's coming in. So I'm learning to change my pitch, planning ahead for the questions that might come up from these teams, helping them understand the next few steps they need to go down to bring in the right people.
Hmm.
Another great example I use is I remember hearing about a tech outage and it involved a third party, and basically someone hit the wrong switch, killed their entire system. And this was another global setup. Well, the team was able to recover their part within their RTO. Like it was really quick. It was back up in line. It was running just fine.
Yep.
But they didn't think who else that might impact. And when you went one or two steps down of if I just do a hard shut off on this, what does that impact? So I could say I have it up and running, no problem. But when you went one or two steps down, you found that the people at the core who it's really for all didn't have the same equipment to respond in that way. So a lot of these had outdated equipment. And when they did that hard shut off, it couldn't just respond and get back online. There were certain steps that needed to take place for a hard shutdown on their end. And when that happened, the helplines were flooded with, calls, what's going on with my systems? This isn't going through. And they didn't think, but when it went back to the core, what actually happened, they were fine. They did exactly what they needed and should have done.
Hmm.
But again, it didn't take that one or two steps further to go,
No.
what could go wrong if this happens here?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've learned to use that too as an example when I have these conversations on, okay, no, you're set, you're good, but with what you had happen to your system, does that impact anybody else? And do we need to ask them, are they set? Or are there any
Mm.
requirements that they need to have so if something happens in your situation, they can recover?
Again, it's exactly, it's those questions that we have to ask people, but it's sort of pushing individuals and teams to just think beyond their own horizon. Because as you say, often plans and I see this time and time again, people write business continuity plans, brilliant plans in concept and in theory, yet they stop at the end of the business. This is my department. They stop it there. And they don't necessarily, unless people are starting to think about this end-to-end process, and that is coming in, and I'm seeing more organizations think like this, particularly with what's been happening in the finance sector in terms of that connect, certainly in the UK, in terms of that connect the dots of understanding, um, you know, there is an end product that customers expect. And to deliver that end product, these different teams have to work together. So if these different teams have to work together, these different teams need to plan together. That's starting to happen, and it's starting to happen in a lot more of wider organizations. And also organizations are starting to think about, again, let's focus on what's really important. But it's still and it sounds like you're finding this, it still sometimes needs that push
Mhm.
because it's not a natural thing for individuals or teams to do that. And it's not a natural thing for organizations to do that. They don't tend to think about the end point or the end product. They often just think about, we'll do business continuity for supply chain, or we'll do business continuity for operations. And we'll all feel really comfortable and happy because we've done that. But we haven't thought about, well, who does supply chain need? And how does that, I mean, business continuity for supply chain is almost an oxymoron because it's such a complicated thing, and actually it's very much they're doing it day in, day out. But that is often what is how organizations will structure this. They will think about it in a very linear way rather than thinking about it in that, how does this all work together and how does this all connect? Again, when you're telling these stories, when you're working with the different teams, do you hear a light bulb, see the light bulb where people suddenly go, oh, that makes more sense? And I hadn't thought about it in this way, but I realize why I do need to go outside of my own team and why there is that connectivity.
Absolutely. Again, people are seeing what we're coming to them for as, more work. Why do I have to do this?
Mm.
Someone once said, we tend to have a hero complex in that we're really, really good at responding to a crisis or something that's going not quite crisis level, but something that's
Mm-hmm.
definitely going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But because we are so great at that quick response, getting the right people together and putting out that fire, we see it almost as though we don't need to do this. But it's like, what
Mm.
if you didn't always have to grab the fire extinguisher every time there was a fire? What if you had these right steps in place that, hey, we could make this go away before it's a big issue? Um, and then also helping them break it down and seeing those few steps down the road, they're starting to go, okay, you know what? When I do this, I know that it's impacting so and so. So maybe we do need to have that conversation. So it's really helping. That's what I'm drawing on a lot, as I said, is my time and experience before joining business continuity
Mm.
to use those explanations to help our other stakeholders understand the business and how BC fits into our business and where that all plays out, and stripping away that technical jargon that people kind of get hung up on sometimes. And again, speaking a language that we all understand here.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and I think it's coming back to where we started. I think that's why I see a huge value in you transition as you have moved into business continuity, and obviously you've learned what business continuity is, but you will always come at it, which I think is fantastic, from it's not really a less traditional background, but it is a less traditional. You're not coming at it from I've done this all my career. So it does give you that different perspective. And it also, from an organizational perspective, means that people see you differently and they hear like what you're saying isn't just I'm the business continuity professional coming in to help you. I've been in the organization for a long time. I've worked in a lot of different places. I can see where business continuity adds value and where we should be planning and where it helps us to be better prepared. And part of that is because I know this organization. That's kind of, to me, what a lot of what you bring. You're not just coming in and you do what you very much understand business continuity, and that's your where you are now. But I just can see that when you're talking to people in the organization, that they will see you differently to anyone else that's coming in that's just done business continuity, because you know the business. And I do think that's one of the things that it is a challenge for us. We have to build credibility in an organization. And sometimes you have to do that very quickly. I've had to do that myself very quickly in lots of organizations, but that's just down to being a bit nosy and listening and asking questions, which I think is, you can do it that way. But I think if you transitioning into business continuity and coming from that food safety does bring so much of, this is the organization, this is how we already approach risk management, this is how we already think about our business, rather than having to learn all of that as well.
yeah, and that's I'm actually finding a challenge a little bit in that I'm leaning into, again, my experience within the organization in a different area and coming over to
Mm.
BC. And then as our team has expanded, trying to help and educate my teammates on our organization's ways,
Mm.
and not forcing them to say like, hey, we do or don't do that, but helping the new teammates understand how BC fits our
Yeah,
setup,
yeah,
not necessarily the other way around. Because of
yeah.
course we're gonna have to get it done, but they also need to understand that we're a little bit different, that you can almost look at each department as a completely separate business unit in itself, not just, hey, we're all under the same umbrella here. No, we might as well be completely different countries
Mm.
or companies. So I'm trying to help them understand, here's the way we need to approach BC that'll help our current state evolve and succeed the best it can. Because the way you may approach BC with other areas, maybe even smaller companies, isn't going to work here in that way. So, how can we accomplish the same goals, but putting a completely different spin on it and making it look just the way it needs to be to fit our needs?
which regular listeners to this podcast and people that follow me will know that's one of the things that I am the most passionate about, because it's not the same. Business continuity, the reason why I love it and the reason why I've done it for as long as I have in lots of different organizations is because it's different every time. But it is important to recognize that. And I think that's a really good point you've made there, that, anyone can implement business continuity in any organization, but if you don't spend time understanding the organization, if you don't spend time almost challenging your view of business continuity in the context of this organization, any organization you're in, if you don't do that, then you are often going to fail, because you're doing it in a way that is just the generic best practice approach, and that's not organizations vary, organizations are different, and as you said, very big organizations don't just vary as an organization, they vary between departments and countries and all of that complexity to put onto this, which I think is really important. And I think your expertise of previously implementing complex programs across that kind of an organization really helps, because you've already had to navigate, actually, why is it not worked here, why is it not worked there, and what would I need to think about if I was going to do this in a different country, if I was going to do this in a different part of the States. You'd have to think slightly differently each time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I'm getting lucky too with my background. And I've had to deal with that from the start. One of my first roles right out of university was hazard analysis and critical control point coordinator. And you have to look at your product
Mhm.
from the second it enters your facility to the time it leaves. And you have to look at every step along the way and say, is there a risk here? And if there's a risk, well, one, what's the risk in the product itself? Two, where's the risk along the way? And then where and how can we mitigate that risk? So whether it be running a product through a metal detector, whether it be cook temperatures for kill steps along the way for our ready to eat products, every product that goes into your line has to have its own HACCP plan, because the products vary enough to where they necessarily can't be the same. And you can't use one plan on another line. They each have to have their own, because something is going to be different. You have a different manufacturer somewhere along the line to provide something. So is there a new risk that's introduced along the way? Same thing with BC. You have to look at it completely different from start to finish within each organization, because something is going to be different. And I got lucky too. Like something as simple as, science-based kill temperatures.
Yeah.
We've historically always used 155 degrees Fahrenheit as the temperature for beef. Well, even within the US, I think there's 2,500 different health departments. So they're all going to have their own view on something for some reason. Normally that cook temperature is the same, but in recent years, one state decided to say, okay, it's 157, not 155. So now we have to try to accommodate for that. And then you go over to Europe, or you go over to Africa or Asia. It constantly changes and a little different. Even when you make that conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius, it's going to be slightly different.
Yeah.
So how do you write your plans and how do you write your audits to include everybody, but not be extremely specific?
Yeah.
And I leaned into that very, very heavily as my time in BC so far, to go, okay, how, it's almost like translation, speaking a different language. You're hearing one thing and you have to translate it to your native tongue and then, go back to the language that you're speaking. And that's a lot of what I'm doing with BC back to food safety and back to BC again.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point to get to, because we are coming towards the end of our time here. But I think, that as a kind of key takeaway is a really important point. A lot of what business continuity is about is trying to find the right translation point to some extent. It is trying to find the thing that people go, okay, I now understand what you're asking of me. I now understand why you're asking those questions. and why you want to understand my process. Because again, come back to, I do think part of our job is to be nosy, and some people don't like that. Some people don't want to explain what they do. But if we can get to the point of the reason why I'm asking this question isn't because I want to do your job or I want to take over anything, or to some extent I care too much about what you do. It's because I want to understand the process.
Mhm.
And I want to be able to ask the right questions. I want to be able to ask you enough about, what if this goes wrong? What if this goes wrong? And part of that to me is, again, that translation piece is then about explaining that's what we mean by business continuity. We don't actually mean do the BIA, do the plan. That's the product. But the process we're trying to do is understand the business and understand where risks lie in that business and what could challenge, your ability to deliver. And I guess as we do close out, thinking about that and just thinking about your experience, is there any last inspiration or thoughts you would like to share with people in terms of what you've learned, but also how you approach it? Because I do think you've got a very fascinating and important approach that people can learn a lot from.
Oh boy, words of wisdom. I don't know about that, but staying curious and staying open-minded. You have to, like you said, you're being nosy, but you're not. You're just trying to understand what is going on. A lot of what we do is, at least in my role, doing the governance. I'm not doing the BIAs for them. I'm not doing the BC plans for them or incident responses. I'm helping put together the guidance and templates so they can look through their process, figure out what's important to them, and come up with something that they could rely on when something goes wrong. Really just humanize it.
Mm.
Talk to people like they're
Mm.
just someone across the table from you having another cup of coffee, and ask questions that also help you understand, but maybe open up their eyes to what what do I need to do here? What am I missing? Because again, when you get caught up in the weeds of talking about BIAs and RTOs and everything else that, all the other acronyms we could throw at them, just talk to them and helping them understand, hey, the most important thing you need to do today is get to work. What could go wrong when you're trying to get to work?
Yeah.
And maybe you get a flat. Okay, if you're driving to work, you get a flat. How are you going to get there? Do you have a spare? Do you have bus fare? Do you have an Uber app? Whatever it may be.
Mm.
Just talk to a level. It's almost like talk to a very sophisticated fifth grader. Talk to them in terms that they understand
Yeah.
in their language, not yours.
Exactly that. I think that's a very insightful and important place to finish. So thank you for that as some words of wisdom for people coming in to listen to today. And thank you for joining me today on The Prepared Leader. Really enjoyed the conversation as always. If you found this valuable, please follow the show, rate the podcast, and share this episode with someone who's navigating change right now. Resilience isn't something we download, it's something we practice. Until next time, stay ready and lead with confidence.